While you can write all your XAML by hand, you'll get bored of this very quickly. It's much easier to build a user interface if you can create and adjust it interactively. And there are two tools that Microsoft provide that you can use for this. Expression Blend is aimed mainly at visual designers, however, it's extremely useful for developers too, mainly because it offers comprehensive support for editing user interfaces built in WPF. Blend's purpose is to create either WPF or Silverlight user interfaces, so it understands XAML, and it knows what all the WPF elements are for. Blend has been in development for some time. In fact, it was the first application to be written in WPF, so it feels a lot more mature than the WPF tools that are currently in Visual Studio. Consequently, many developers choose to use Blend in preference to Visual Studio for creating and editing WPF user interfaces. While Visual Studio is the more natural choice for a developer, Blend does so much more when it comes to interactive XAML editing that it tends to look like a better choice today for certain kinds of tasks. So here is Expression Blend. If I ask it to create a new project, you can see that it offers WPF applications and also WPF control libraries, as well as supporting Silverlight version 1. So here I'm going to build a new WPF application. Let's call this one Made in Blend. And I click OK, and it will go ahead and create me a bunch of files. And if we take a closer look at this one here, we can see that it's a CSproj file. If I open this up in Windows Explorer, you can see that it's created me some C# files, some XAML files, and a CSproj file, which is the file format Visual Studio uses to represent C# projects. So Blend works with the same project concept that Visual Studio uses. And it uses the same build engine as well, the MS build engine for constructing the application. And this is an important feature of Blend. It means that the designer, the visual designer working on the application's layout and appearance, is working with the real application. They're not building some mock-up, which then has to be passed over to the developers in the hope that they don't break too much of the design as they try and implement it. The visual designer has the opportunity to work directly with the real XAML that will be running the user interface once the application is live. So, what can we do in here? Well, I've got this design surface in the middle. It's a little bit cramped because I'm running at a fairly low resolution here for the screen recording. And also I've cranked up the size of the typefaces a little bit. So normally you have a bit more space to play with than this. But for now, let's look at some of the drawing primitives. You've got simple stuff like rectangles and ellipses. So if I just drag those out, it starts to feel kind of like a drawing package. If I go to the properties panel here, I can do things like change the fill color. And I can also rotate it. I can use the selection tool to move the thing around. And we've got Bezier curves as well. So you've got some fairly basic drawing features. Now, to be honest, most visual designers are not going to use this to produce the application designs. They're going to carry on using the tools they're already familiar with, so maybe things like Adobe Illustrator. And those will be able to export in formats that can then be imported into the Expression suite. So the actual drawings will be produced in the same way as they were before. And Blend's role is not as a drawing tool. Blend's role is very specifically about producing WPF user interface layouts. That's the thing that it knows how to do. So although it does have some drawing tools, which are occasionally useful just for getting things in place and up and running, its main job is to understand WPF. So for example, if you look at this part of the toolbar, you can see that it knows about all of the layout primitives. I can add grids, canvases, stack panels, and so on. And actually, the root element that WPF produces for the window, this thing labeled layout root here, you can see that the type of element is a grid as well. So I'm already using the system.windows.controls.grid layout panel that's part of WPF. And I've got these tools down the edge here that I can use to set up grid rows and grid columns. I can choose whether I'd like to have a fixed size, measured in pixels row here, or maybe an auto size thing that bases its size on the content, or something which is proportionally sized. They call that star sizing. We'll talk about that later. But basically it means that that row will grow as the window itself grows in proportion with all the other rows in the window. So it knows about these things. These are layout rules that are specific to how WPF's grid works, and it knows what they mean. And I could also add nested stuff inside of here. I could say I'd like a stack panel in this thing here. And then maybe I could add a button. I have to actually select the stack panel first. So let me double click that. And now I can start adding elements inside of there. And again, you can see it's understood that this stack panel lays things out in a certain way. It's arranged them in a stack. And it lets me drag the things, change the order like so. So it has built-in knowledge of what the layout primitives do. And if I go over here, this bottom button here brings up the so-called asset library. This shows me controls and other elements that are available to me in WPF. So here I can find things like the checkbox, or I can add a menu, or a pop-up window, or a password box, whatever it might be. So this is what Blend does. It knows about what the features of WPF are. Now notice that I can work in XAML if I want to. Either I can go into a fully XAML mode, or I can get a split screen mode. Let me just clear away the toolboxes. If you hit the tab key, the toolboxes on either side go away for a bit, so you can see slightly more easily what you're doing. And I've got this split view here, where I can look at the design on the top, and then the XAML at the bottom. So if I find this rectangle, I can change that fill to be something different. It's using ARGB, the alpha, red, green, and blue. I can actually just type in a color name if I prefer. Type in cyan, and notice that it changes up here straight away. If I move the thing around, you can see the numbers start to change in here. Now, the use of the margin may seem a little bit odd. That's actually an upshot of the grid layout that I'm using here. But it basically, as I change things on the design surface, it will alter the numbers in the XAML. So I've got either interactive editing with an instant view as to what the effect is in the XAML, or vice versa. I can just type stuff in here and have an instant visualization on the screen of the effect of that. Now, Blend also knows how to deal with events. But it understands that it doesn't really do code properly. If I select one of the buttons and go to the Properties tab and click on this Events item, it shows me all of the events. So I got click up there. And I can double click on this to say I'd like to add an event handler. Now, if you've got Visual Studio installed, Blend can go and find it and can launch it and can enable you to edit the code in there. So now here I am in the code-behind file for window1.xaml.cs, so the main XAML file I was just editing. This is the code-behind that defines the behavior for that. And I've got my button click handler in here. So I can do things like go back and forth between Visual Studio and Blend, and start editing things over here, and then hook up the behavior in the code behind in Visual Studio. So let's give one of the buttons a name. I'll just save this, and then in the code behind, I'll just wire up some behavior. I'll hit build. And if I run this, you can see it's there, and I can click one of the buttons, and there's my behavior. Now, if I go back to Expression Blend, the designer can also test the solution from here. So they can say test solution F5. And the designer can try things out. They can click at the button and go, oh, that's not quite right. That clearly doesn't fit. And they can also look at the effect that the grid layout has had on the design. And this means that they can do more than just work with still screenshots. They can try the application out in its real setting and see whether their design changes have had the effect that they want. So they could then maybe come in and say, well, actually, I'm not so sure about that. This stack panel needs to have a larger initial size so that it can accommodate the message. And maybe I'd like to split that across a couple of grid columns. So if we look at the root grid, that's now covering 2 of the columns. So maybe that'll be a better layout choice. But the key thing is, Blend and Visual Studio, between them, both work with the same project format. So designers and developers both work with the real application. And Visual Studio and Blend are both perfectly happy to be working simultaneously on the same project files on the same machine. You do need to be careful to save regularly. So if you make edits to the same file in both programs without having saved first in one before changing the other, there's no way to merge the changes. But as long as you're saving regularly, each program will notice when the other one updates the file. It'll watch the file for changes and will offer to reload them for you. So if I had in Visual Studio, if I actually had the XAML file open, so here I'm loading the same XAML file into Visual Studio's editor, changes made over in Blend, if I go back to Blend, If I move that slightly and then save the file and then go back to Visual Studio, it notices. It says this has been changed. Do you want to reload it? I go yes. Tell it I'd like it to update. And there we are. Things have moved around. Now this is Visual Studio's editor. This is the environment built into Visual Studio 2008 for editing XAML files. And in some ways it's quite similar to what I just showed you in Blend. We have a split view with the design, so I can select things and move them around. It also has a certain understanding of the grid layout, so I can adjust grid settings here, and I can do things like double-click on a button to say I'd like to add an event handler. So in some ways it looks sort of similar to what I was just using. It just happens to be a more developer-oriented environment. And actually we get some things that you don't have in Blend. If I start typing into the XAML here, I get IntelliSense, which I would not get in Blend. Blend doesn't know how to offer IntelliSense today. So there are some advantages to working in Visual Studio. However, Visual Studio's understanding of layout, and particularly nested layouts, is less good. It's not quite so clever at letting me work with, for example, stack panels. It doesn't have the ability to reorder things in the stack just by dragging, unlike Blend. And there comes a point also where Visual Studio just doesn't cope correctly with complex layouts. You can create things in Blend which Visual Studio doesn't really understand at all. So in reality, most developers choose not to use this Visual Studio editor for anything more than fairly trivial stuff. In practice, most serious WPF developers use Blend to do their interactive design. So they'll use Visual Studio for XAML editing because it's got a better XML editor than Blend offers. But they'll use Blend as the main interactive environment for doing editing. And so you have both open at the same time. So, Blend is the most powerful interactive WPF editor, and Visual Studio excels once you start wanting to edit source code, either the XAML or the more traditional Codey code like C# and VisualBasic.NET. And in practice, most WPF developers work with both tools open all the time.